Okay, so we're going to be moving right along into the muscular system. And just like any of our organ systems, as we start, we're going to start at the cellular level, and then we're going to move on up to the tissue level, and then eventually the organ and organ system level. So we're going to start out by talking about muscle cells and muscle tissue, and then we'll kind of move our way up. These are just some images from the Body World exhibit. So if you haven't been, especially after you take this anatomy class, they're just fascinating. And so make a point to try to go see it the next time it's in town, or next time you're visiting somewhere and it's in town. Make a point to go see this because it will be vastly much more interesting to you now that you've taken anatomy. Okay, so just quick random muscle facts, just fun facts. Muscle actually means little mouse. So the ancient Romans thought that when they flexed their bicep muscles, it looked like little mice were running under their skin. So hence the name little mouse or muscle. So that's how we got the name muscle. There are about 650 skeletal muscles in the body. And the smallest skeletal muscle is called the stapedius, and it's actually going to attach to one of the bones, the stapes bone in the inner ear, so that tiny bone. So you can picture that tiny bone has a tiny little muscle associated with it. And the largest muscle is going to be, of course, your gluteus maximus, which is pretty easy to imagine there. The most active muscles are going to be your external eye muscles. Again, makes sense because your eyes are constantly moving, right? And then if you take all of your body muscles and you could contract all of your muscles in one single direction, it would equal about 25 tons of force. So pretty impressive, right? Our muscles do a lot of work for us. And banging your head on a wall, just in case you wanted to know, uses about 150 calories per hour because of the muscles that are involved with it. So there you go. Again, these are just fun muscle facts just to introduce muscles. I'm not going to test you on those. But I do want you to know that as we introduce muscles here, I want you to keep in mind that all of the movements that we do are a result of muscles contracting. So any motion that we do is a result from this alternating contraction. And contraction, when we say contraction, it's the shortening of a muscle, okay? And then the relaxation of that muscle is then the lengthening of that muscle back to its original state. So again, as we do all of these different movements, the reason that we can do these different movements is that it is this kind of fine-tuned combination of these different muscles that are contracting to allow us to do these movements. So, there might be a partial contraction of like your pectoralis muscle and more robust contraction of your bicep muscle to be able to like pull your arm in. Okay. So it is this fine tuning of, and it's pretty amazing when you think about all of these actions that we can do with our body and all of the muscles that are interacting and how our brain, right, is able to control all this and fine tune the contraction of all these muscles to allow these different movements. It's pretty impressive. Okay, so obviously the skeletal system provides kind of a leverage and a support framework for all of these movements because our muscles are attaching to these bones, right? And so as the muscle shortens, it's oftentimes bringing one bone closer to another bone. Okay. The scientific study of muscles is just called myology, and that's because when we talk about muscles, I know I have it in here somewhere, the term myo is often used. That's the prefix that tells you that we're talking about muscles. So myo, MYS. So you're going to see we're going to talk about things like myofibrils and myofibers. And so that tells you that we're talking about muscles. Also, where you'll see we'll use the term MYS sometimes. And then sarco is also much more commonly used. So these are all the prefixes that mean muscle. And you're going to see when we talk about like the sarcoplasm, that's going to be basically the cytoplasm inside a muscle cell, or the sarcoplasmic reticulum is like basically the endoplasmic reticulum in a muscle cell. So sarco, again, is that term that tells you that you're talking about muscle. Really, myo and sarco are your kind of most common prefixes. So you really want to think anytime you hear the term myo or sarco as a prefix, you want to instantly think muscle. Okay. So again, it's this alternating contraction and relaxation of these muscle cells that is allowing us to do all of these movements and moving, again, our bones in relation to our other bones. And it's important that we kind of talk about at the cellular level, we have to kind of change this chemical energy that we have, right? In the form of ATP into mechanical energy that can be used to actually do work and move bones, okay? So we're going to talk about all of these things as we go through this lab on how muscle contraction works. And you know, it's one of those things that we take for granted. Muscle contraction seems like such an easy thing, but it's really, really complex. As you're going to see, there's 4 lectures on this, and we're going to talk about all these processes that are involved. So hang in there for the ride. So when we talk about muscle, there are 3 types of muscle tissue. We have skeletal muscle tissue, cardiac, which is typically what you think of when you think of muscle, and then cardiac muscle tissue, which is obviously going to be found in the heart, and then smooth muscle, which is going to be found in kind of our hollow organs and places like the GI tract. So again, only skeletal muscle and smooth muscle cells are elongated, and so because they're these kind of elongated, long cells, they're just not your typical cell. They're not these pretty round blobs. They're these elongated cells, especially when I show you some of your skeletal muscles, right? Some of the skeletal muscles are these really long cells. And so because of that, we refer to them as muscle fibers. Now, this is the tricky part because there is a lot of terminology here. So this is where you might want to make yourself some note cards of like, what are all the terms for muscle cell? So muscle cell can be called a muscle fiber or myofiber. So anytime you hear muscle fiber or myofiber, we're referring to just a single muscle cell, either skeletal muscle cell or smooth muscle cell. So again, it's just terminology. Don't blame me. I didn't come up with it, but it's terminology you just have to get used to. And we'll go through that in a little bit more detail in just a minute here. So hang in there. So these 3 types of muscle, we're first going to talk about skeletal muscle, and then we'll talk about cardiac and smooth. Skeletal muscle is obviously the muscle that we think of when we're doing a lot of our movements, when we're moving our bones. So this is the muscle that attaches to our bones, our skin, and our fascia. And when we look at it, it's going to be what's called striated. Again, this has these light and dark, these kind of light and dark bands. That's striations when we talk about striations. And so again, it's striated with these light and dark bands. And you can see that underneath a microscope if you look at a muscle fiber underneath a microscope. And obviously our skeletal muscles are under voluntary control, right? Like we can control our skeletal muscle contractions, unlike our heart, right? So again, it's under voluntary control. And then another thing to remember, this kind of takes us back to when we did the tissues. Way back in the beginning of the semester, remember that skeletal muscles are kind of these odd muscle cells or muscle fibers again. I'm just going to really try to use that term so you get used to it because they're multinucleate. What that means is, again, one muscle cell or one muscle fiber is going to have many different nuclei. So that makes skeletal muscle cells really kind of unique. And the reason, if you wondered why is that, you're going to see it's going to be because these single muscle fibers are really long. And so they need to have multiple nuclei that are coding again for proteins and things to be made all throughout that cell because it's such a long cell. So that's why it has to be multinucleate. And so your muscle cells are your skeletal muscle cells are going to be your longest of your muscle cells. So then let's talk about cardiac muscle. So here, cardiac muscle, you can see, looks quite different than your skeletal muscle. They're going to be these kind of shorter, branched cells, so you can see, but they're going to be striated in appearance. So that's kind of the thing that they have in common with skeletal muscle is they're both striated. But again, cardiac muscle cells are going to be really branched like this. They usually only have, one single nuclei, maybe two at the most, but they're not, multinucleate with many different nuclei like your skeletal muscles. And again, you can see they're really branched. Also, they're going to have these intercalated discs, which you can see right here as I'm pointing to. And those intercalated discs are going to be really important because remember that cardiac muscles cells are going to be autorhythmic. So they have this built-in pacemaker and they're all going to contract together, right? Because you need like all of the atrial cells to contract at the same time. So again, this is under involuntary control. Thank goodness you don't have to think about your heart beating, right? I mean, if I had to, constantly think about my heart beating, I wouldn't be alive because I would forget, right? So thank goodness our cardiac muscle cells are under involuntary control. And we'll talk about the autorhythmic cycle that occurs in these cardiac muscle cells when we get into 202 and we get into the heart. It's pretty impressive as well. Okay, and then the third type of muscle is going to be smooth muscle. And your smooth muscle is going to be either attached to hair follicles in the skin or in the walls of hollow organs. So obviously this one that's attached to the hair follicles is going to be your erector pili muscle, which we just did when we did the skin. So your erector pili muscle is smooth muscle, and again, that's why you don't have to think about your goosebumps, right? It's involuntary, it happens. So again, smooth muscle, like cardiac muscles, cardiac muscle cells are going to be involuntary, okay? Unlike cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle is non-striated, and it's going to have this spindle shape to it as well, okay? So you can see they're all vastly different, right? Like these two are striated, but this one's under voluntary control. This one's under involuntary control. These two are both under involuntary control, but this one's striated, this one's not. Smooth muscle has the spindles. Again, your cardiac muscle cells are branched and have the intercalated discs. So those are all things that you want to compartmentalize and be able to do. So, if this is kind of new to you, again, make a card with skeletal muscle and all the characteristics, then make one with cardiac muscle and all the characteristics, and then with smooth muscle and all the characteristics. But yeah, so you're going to typically find smooth muscle in much of the body in your hollow organs. So things like your blood vessels, this is what allows your blood vessels to constrict, right? And then dilate as well when it relaxes. Also in the GI tract. So again, thank goodness we have smooth muscle lining our GI tract, right? Because it's involuntary, it's under involuntary control. And that means that as you eat food, you don't have to think about okay, I need to move that food a little bit farther down the esophagus. I'm going to contract and push it into the stomach now, right? And so we can be very grateful that these smooth muscle is under involuntary control. Okay, so again, this is just kind of a review slide so you can see these are actual microscope images of skeletal muscle here, and then cardiac muscle here. You can see these intercalated discs quite nicely here. And then here you can see that spindle shape of those smooth muscle cells. Okay. And there you can see this is just kind of up close. Again, skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle here. Okay, so Here's my funny meme for you just to keep you awake, right? So the functions of muscle tissue. Obviously, producing body movements. It's a pretty easy one. You might not think of stabilizing body positions. So, when you're standing, it's hard to think about when you're just standing still, the fact that you're actually contracting quite a few muscles in your body just to hold yourself in that upright position. So again, stabilizing our body positions, holding our neck upright, those are functions of muscle tissue that we don't always think about. Regulating organ volumes, right? So we have these bands of smooth muscle that are called sphincters at the beginning and the end of each organ. And so again, as we want to allow things to move into the stomach, we have a sphincter that will open and allow that food into the stomach. And then when we want to release that what we call chyme out of, which is basically when we get to your digestive tract, we'll kind of talk about that. But as your stomach releases that into the intestines, again, it will do that through the sphincter. So again, we can regulate what's in our body organs. We can do this obviously with our bladder, right? We can regulate what volume of liquid or substances in our organs with these smooth muscle sphincters. And then movement of substances within the body. So obviously we need to be able to move our blood, right? So again, that's one of the main functions of our heart, right? Is to be able to move the blood throughout the body. Same with lymph, as we'll talk about when we do muscle contractions and things like that. We talk about this more in 202. It helps to move our lymph fluid. Urine, air, food, air, talking about just, again, the contractions that allow your lungs to take in air, right? So with the big diaphragm muscle, food and fluids, and again, sperm. All of these things are going to move throughout the body with the help of some contractions of some muscle tissue somewhere. And then producing heat, right? So this is one of the things that helps make us endothermic. So again, as we contract our skeletal muscles, they actually release heat. They release some of that energy in the form of heat. And so anytime that, you're really cold, you'll notice you start to shiver. And the reason that you're starting to shiver is that your muscles are contracting in an effort to release some of that heat, so you can use some of that heat to bring back your body temperature up closer to homeostasis. So producing heat, again, is a function you might not think of for muscle tissue. So make sure you know these basic functions, be able to recognize these basic functions of muscle tissue. 5 properties of muscle tissue. So one, obviously, it needs to be excitable. So again, you need to be able to, it needs to be able to respond to certain chemicals that are released from a nerve cell that's innervating that muscle, and then passing on that excitability, passing on that ability of that cell to basically be able to be excited and contract. Okay. Conductivity is just the ability to propagate these electrical signals over the membrane. So once we've excited these muscle fibers, okay, then their ability to pass that message along through these electrical signals over the entire membrane so that the muscle all contracts as one is conductivity. And then contractility is just the ability to shorten and generate force. So here again, you can see the bicep muscle here is contracting. And as that bicep muscle contracts, it generates enough force to pull the forearm up. And then extensibility and elasticity are terms that we kind of talked about in the very early parts of the semester when we were talking about tissue. And if you remember, when we talked about extensibility, I kind of gave the example of gum, and then elasticity, a rubber band. So extensibility is the ability to be stretched without damaging the tissue. So for example, if you take a piece of gum, right, you can stretch it, but it's, if you hold that piece of gum in your mouth, you can stretch it and pull it out, but it's not going to bounce back and hit you, right? So it's extensible, but it's not elastic, okay? Now, a rubber band is both extensible and elastic, and that's because after it's stretched, it has the ability to return to its original shape. So if you put a rubber band in your mouth and you stretch it, right, it's going to pop back. Okay, so that's the difference between extensibility and elasticity. You can think gum is extensible, but rubber bands are both extensible and elastic. So again, when we talk about muscles, they need to have both of these properties. They need to be extensible, and then they also need to be able to return to their original shape. So when we talk about, again, these skeletal muscles, each skeletal muscle is going to be a separate organ, okay? So if you're talking about the biceps brachii muscle in your upper arm here, that's its own organ, okay? And it's all of these muscles in our body are part of the organ muscular system, right? So when we look at like just the biceps brachii, let's say, okay, as an organ, then we can break it down and look at the actual tissue and the cells within that tissue. And those cells, again, are what we call muscle fibers or myofibers. So one skeletal muscle cell is, again, going to be called a myofiber. I'm just going to write this down for you because I feel like there are so many terms. So again, we can call a skeletal muscle cell a again, my writing is terrible. Myofiber, or a muscle cell, or a muscle fiber, okay? But I don't know if myofiber makes it's used interchangeably throughout my lecture and the textbooks, but I don't know if I formally ever introduced it. So myofiber is the same thing as a muscle fiber, which is the same thing as a single muscle cell, okay? So muscle cell equals muscle fiber, which equals myofiber. All the same thing, I know. I don't know why we make it so complicated, but again, I didn't make it up, so I'm just the messenger here. Don't hate the messenger. Okay. So when we talk about skeletal muscles, to hold in one single skeletal muscle organ, right, like the biceps brachii, we have to have connective tissue that holds all of those muscle cells together that are going to make up that muscle. So we have what's called superficial fascia, and that's going to be all this loose kind of connective tissue and fat that's kind of on top of the muscle. So that's going to be the most superficial layer, right? And then as we go a little deeper to look into the muscle, we find our deep fascia. And that's going to be this kind of dense, irregular connective tissue that we have that's surrounding the muscle, around the muscle. Then we're going to have connective tissue components of the muscle, basically inside the actual muscle, okay? So we're going to have this stuff called epimysium. Epimysium is going to surround the whole muscle and hold all of these, what we call fascicles or bundles. We're going to call these fascicles or bundles of muscle cells together. So that's what our epimysium is going to do. It's going to hold all these together. And then we have the perimysium, which is going to surround each of these fascicles or bundles of muscle cells. And then we're going to have the endomysium, which is going to be this kind of white connective tissue here that surrounds each individual muscle fiber or muscle cell, okay? So if you're looking here, it's kind of like, our muscles kind of look like fiber optic cables, I think. And if you look, there's each individual muscle cell, okay, again, is going to be bundled together to form these fascicles, okay, basically these bundles of muscle cells. And so we call them fascicles. And then these fascicles are going to be all bundled together to form our actual whole muscle, okay? So I'm going to go through this in the slide here in just a minute that has a kind of more visual of this. So again, all these connective tissue layers are going to extend the epimysium, the paramysium, the endomysium, again, this deep fascia, all of that is going to extend past the muscle, okay? And then past the muscle belly to form what we call the tendons. And remember, those tendons are made of that dense, regular connective tissue, again, that has all of those fibers running in the same direction. Those collagen fibers in there. Okay, so let's zoom out and then zoom in and then zoom out. So again, like we talked about, when we talk about a whole muscle is gonna consist of all of these different kind of bundles upon bundles upon bundles, right? So let's start at the most cellular level here. So here, this is actually an individual muscle fiber, one single muscle cell, okay? Now inside here, you're gonna go, well, what are all these things? These things are called myofibrils, which I'm gonna show you in just a minute. Myofibrils are gonna be basically these bundles of these contractile filaments that are gonna be in there. They're actin and myosin, okay? So your myofibrils are going to be these contractile filaments, bundles of contractile filaments inside a single muscle fiber or muscle cell, okay? So here's one muscle cell. Around this muscle cell, okay, surrounding this muscle cell, you're going to have what's called the endomysium. So you see in the endomysium will surround each of these individual muscle cells here and here and here. So each of these are individual muscle fiber muscle cells, okay? And that endomysium is going to surround them. And then when you bundle all of these together to make up your fascicle or your bundle of muscle cells, that's going to be all held together by the paramysium, okay? Peri meaning around, right? So again, this is what we call a fascicle, or basically a bundle of muscle cells, okay? So then, okay, we can take all of these fascicles. So here's a fascicle, here's fascicle, here's fascicle, and you can see the paramysium, right? The paramysium right around here and here. All of these, and this is actually a nice image of this underneath a microscope. So here you can see paramysium here. All of these bundles, okay, then will get bundled together again by the epimysium. And then that's what makes up your whole muscle, okay? And then you're going to see that that endomysium, the paramysium, and the epimysium are all going to extend past the belly of the muscle to the actual bone and form the tendon, okay? So they actually extend past the muscle cells and then connect to the bone through the tendon. And so it is this epimysium, paramysium, endomysium, and things like your superficial fascia that are actually making up your tendon. Okay, so again, think of this as like your fiber optic cables, and again, it's a really efficient way to package all of this material neatly, these contractile fibers and things neatly in a muscle, okay? So that, again, it will all function together. So again, this just is going through, if you want to kind of read these each individually, it starts at the muscle fiber, muscle cell, and then they're bundled together, get together to form a fascicle, and then the fascicles are bundled together to form your whole muscle. Now, what's interesting is if you look at meat, this is what causes this marbling. The marbling that you see in this meat is because of paramysium, right? Because here there's going to be fascicles. There's fascicle in here, fascicle, fascicle. So the marbling of your meat when you are looking at, because again, usually when you're eating meat, you're eating mostly muscle, right? Maybe some superficial and deep fascia here that might have some fat associated with it. But for the most part, you're eating mostly skeletal muscle. And so this marbling effect is actually this connective tissue that makes up things like, again, the paramecium around the fascicles. So kind of interesting when you actually look at a piece of meat, you'll never look at a piece of meat the same again. Okay, so just to kind of review all this, I wanted to take it down from the very kind of broken down within the cell, not even just to the cellular level, but within the cell. And then we're going to bring it all the way up to a skeletal muscle. So we're going to start with these contractile filaments. So not even just the myofibrils, but the little contractile filaments that we're going to be talking about in just a minute. And that's going to be your actin and myosin filaments that are going to make up your myofibrils. So you're going to bundle these actin and myosin filaments, right, into these nice, neat little bundles to form our myofibrils, okay? Now, the myofibrils, again, are just these bundles of filaments. And there are lots of those myofibrils, okay, along with things like your sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is basically your muscle endoplasmic reticulum, and your nuclei, and all kinds of, other organelles, right, that belong in a cell, mitochondria, things like that. So you're going to bundle all of those with, again, these myofibrils to make up a single muscle cell or muscle fiber or myofiber, okay? So I know it gets confusing, but make sure that you know the difference between myofibrils and myofiber, okay? Myofibrils are bundles of contractile fibers inside a myofiber, which is a muscle fiber or muscle cell, okay? Now, if we, again, bundle these myofibers or muscle cells together, we form a fascicle. And then if we bundle those fascicles together, we form our whole skeletal muscle cell. And just as a reminder, around each of your individual muscle fibers, you're going to have the endomysium is going to be the connective tissue, right? That's around that. And that will help to connect the muscle cells to each other within a fascicle. Now, what holds that fascicle together is the paramecium, okay, that surrounds those bundle of muscle fibers. And then all of those fascicles are going to be held together by the epimysium, and that, again, is going to form your whole skeletal muscle. Okay? So hopefully this will help you out and kind of make sense of this organization. And then keep in mind that the endomysium, paramysium, the epimysium are going to extend past, this connective tissue is going to extend past the muscle and form the tendon that will attach to the bone. Okay, so when we talk about these each individual muscle fiber, okay, there is both nerve and blood supply to them. So each skeletal muscle is served by a nerve, artery, and 2 veins, okay? And so the skeletal muscle as a whole, and then we'll talk about even how that nerve branches to the individual skeletal muscle fibers or skeletal muscle cells. So it's pretty impressive, and you can see that here, this branching axon of this motor, what we call motor unit, which is going to be this motor neuron branching to these skeletal muscle cells. But again, at this point, we'll kind of keep it simple. Each skeletal muscle, again, is supplied by nerve, artery, and 2 veins. And each motor neuron supplies, again, multiple muscle cells. So it's going to branch like this. So this motor neuron's coming out here, and it's going to branch to supply many muscle cells. And the point where that motor neuron forms a junction with this muscle cell is called the neuromuscular junction, right? Totally makes sense. Neuro, nerve, muscular, muscle. So that we call this the neuromuscular junction. We're going to talk about what happens and how that message of excitability is transferred from the neuron to the muscle cell in more depth here coming up. So each muscle cell is going to be supplied by one motor neuron and is going to be in contact with 1 or 2 capillaries, okay? But most important here is really that you remember, more so than the blood flow. I mean, I want you to know that it's vascular. Obviously, muscle is vascular, but I want you to know that each muscle cell is supplied by 1 motor neuron, okay? 1 motor neuron kind of terminal branch. And the nerve fibers and the capillaries are going to be found in the endomysium. So you'll find this in the endomysium connective tissue around each muscle cell. Okay, skeletal muscle cells, again, remember, are these really long, cylindrical, multinucleate cells. And so really quick, this is what each individual muscle fiber is going to look like. And remember, I told you that just like any other cell, it's going to have all these organelles. It's just going to look different because most of the inside of the cell is going to be taken up by these myofibrils, right? And that's because these myofibrils have all of the contractile microfilaments inside, the actin and the myosin filaments that are important for the function of the muscle, right? Or in the muscle cell. So we're going to see, we still have mitochondria. There's still lots of mitochondria, good old mitochondria. You need that, again, to make that ATP. So you're going to see those. They're just kind of squished in between the myofibrils here. And then you're going to see, instead of endoplasmic reticulum, we're going to call it sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's still endoplasmic reticulum, but it has a very specialized function in terms of storing calcium. And we'll talk about why this is in just a minute. So because of that, we call it sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then you're going to see the outside of basically the cell membrane of these each individual muscle cell or muscle fiber is going to be called the sarcolemma, okay? So this sarcolemma is basically the same thing as plasma membrane. It's just for a skeletal muscle. And you're going to see it's going to have these little special invaginations of that sarcolemma that go into the interior of the cell. And we're going to call those T-tubules. And those T-tubules are really important for transmitting the message, basically that message that we get from that motor neuron, the excitability. So they're going to transport that message into the interior of the cell through these T-tubules, okay? And so that's kind of what the inside, and then you're going to see all these nuclei because they're multinucleate. So I just want to kind of introduce that. We're going to get into more of the details in that in just a minute, but I wanted to introduce what that looks like inside a muscle cell. So again, you can see that sarcolemma is just a muscle fiber cell membrane. So it's just a muscle cell membrane. The T-tubules, again, are going to be those little tiny invaginations here that you see of that sarcolemma, which again is just a plasma membrane. And that is going to help pass on that electrical message that we're going to call an action potential that will allow a muscle fiber to contract. And then the sarcoplasm is just going to be the cytoplasm for a muscle fiber, okay? So really easy. Again, it's just that sarco term. We're using instead of cytoplasm, it's sarcoplasm. And again, the reason that we give it a different name is it's going to have some different stuff in it. So it's going to have lots of these things called glycosomes that are going to hold lots of glycogen for energy production. Remember, glycogen is just like big branches of glucose put together, okay? So it's just a way that we can store glucose molecules. And that's because, again, muscle cells obviously need to have lots of storage so that they can contract. So we need, a lot of glycogen and glucose eventually. We can break down that glycogen to glucose to produce all that energy, okay? And then we need myoglobin to store oxygen. So, like hemoglobin is our protein that holds on to, oxygen in our blood. So myoglobin is going to be the protein that holds on to oxygen in our, you got it, myo muscle. Okay, so our myoglobin is going to store oxygen in our muscle cells. So again, we have these modified organelles. Make sure you're familiar with them: myofibrils, sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the T-tubules. Okay. And so again, here's my formula. I've talked about myofibrils a lot already, but myofibrils again are these densely packed rod-like elements of contractile fibers, okay? So you're going to have lots of these microfilaments or these actin and myosin filaments that we're going to talk a lot about. And again, a single muscle fiber can contain thousands of them, and they account for about 80% of the muscle cell volume. You kind of saw that. They take up most of the space inside the muscle cell, okay? You don't have to know the 80% and thousands, but just to show you again, to keep in mind that those myofibrils take up most of the interior of the muscle cell. Again, we talked about striations in the dark and light bands. We're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get into sarcomeres. So again, this is just kind of showing you kind of the interior of one myofiber so that you can see these myofibrils, and these myofibrils are going to have these bands, these kind of dark and light bands that we're going to call, the dark band is going to be called an A band, the light band is going to be called an I band here. We're going to get into this. And so you'll see that those myofibrils are going to have those bands, and that's what's going to create the kind of overall striations that you're going to see in each of your individual muscle fibers or muscle cells. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and then I'll start with the next lecture on sarcomeres.